Hello and welcome to Autistic Changeling. Today we're going to talk about executive dysfunction, part 2, because I already explained what executive dysfunction is in a separate video. So if you're not familiar with the concept, then you might want to go and watch the other video I made. I was asked to talk about what techniques I use to stay organized and to keep handle on executive dysfunction, so I'm going to talk about that a little bit in today's video. First, I think it's important to remember that executive dysfunction contains a lot of different types of difficulties, and not everyone who deals with executive dysfunction will deal with every single type of difficulty that it can include. So I think it's important to keep in mind what specific things you deal with when trying to find solutions, because something that helps someone else might not help you, just in general, but also especially if you're not even struggling with the same type of executive dysfunction. I also want to point out that, again, everything is subjective. What helps me might not help you. And also, I do still deal with executive dysfunction. I haven't completely mastered it or anything. So this is advice, but not necessarily 100% guaranteed to work in your life or in my own. But with that, we're set in motion. Why did I use that turn of phrase? I don't know. So anyway, I think the number one thing I want to point out as well is also that it's really easy, I think, to get sort of lost in the rabbit hole of looking at ways people organize things and super complicated systems and some shiny new thing that you think is going to solve all your problems. If you just, organize your notebooks this way, then you'll finally be able to conquer it for good. And usually it's really easy to get lost in thinking of all the ways you could organize things rather than actually organizing them, and that's not really helpful, I don't think. Maybe it is for some people. For me, it's not. It's just you spend all afternoon reading on ways other people organize things instead of actually organizing them, and then you didn't really organize anything after all, right? So that's something to keep in mind. So for me, I don't use any complicated systems of organizing things because I wouldn't stick with them. I did look into a lot of different ways people organize things, the self-help blog style stuff. I don't stick with any of that. It just requires too much work to upkeep, and if it requires a lot of work to keep up, it's probably not going to stay kept up. And something that you use to organize things is only effective if you actually use it. So if you're not going to use it, then don't bother. In college, I used different ways of keeping track of things than I do now because I needed to keep track of different things in college than I do now. So I'm going to talk about college first, and then I'll talk about how I do things now. So in college, mostly the things I needed to keep track of were my assignments for school and how I organized my notes and that sort of thing. I lived in the dorm room, so there was no need for shopping or anything like that. Because I would just eat at the cafeteria. So as far as homework assignments and stuff like that went in college, honestly, a lot of the assignments were very cyclical. So they could be part of a routine. You would always have X assignment due on Y day every week. And that really helps. If something follows a routine naturally, then you don't have to spend as much effort remembering it and keeping track of when you're going to do it because you just do it the same day every week. So that's helpful. The first couple of weeks, you're still getting into the routine of the school year, right? So then I would write everything down. But after everything became part of that cycle, I would only write down the things that were big things that didn't fall into the same routine everything else did. So if homework is due every Wednesday for thermodynamics, just an example, I don't remember when homework was due for thermodynamics, but if homework is due every Wednesday for thermodynamics, and you have some essay for an elective course that's due, a month into the school year, then I would write down the essay, but I wouldn't write down the homework every single week. So I would just find something to write down my assignments on and what I had to work on, and I would just write down, the days that important things were due. I did mess around with different organizational things that have each day on them. You write everything down. If that works for you, that's great. I had a hard time keeping up with them, but I did use them for some periods of time in school and not for others. Mostly in school, I just kept track of what I needed to work on in the next week or so. And I would remind myself in my head as I was walking to and from class what I had to do later that day, and that helped me to remember that it had to be done, and also kind of prepared me mentally for doing it later that day. If I tell myself enough times I'm gonna do it, then maybe I actually will, kind of a thing. I'm not sure how much that helped or not, but I did do that a lot to keep track of what I was going to do. It did cause a lot of, I think, exhaustion, reminding yourself every day of what you're going to do, but it also did help me not forget things that were assigned. As far as organizing my actual notebooks and stuff, I went very old school with that. I took a lot of math and science courses because I majored in chemical engineering, so I didn't really keep track of notes on the computer as much because it's hard to type out the types of things that I was taking notes on. So I basically just kept an actual notebook for everything that I needed to take notes on. Well, I used binders because you can add and remove sheets from them. When I was studying, I decided that the best way for me to study was to go through my notes and summarize everything. Basically just reading through it, rewriting it in just a piece of printer paper, basically. And I would go through and categorize the information and, leave off anything that was now such common knowledge I didn't need to write it down. That was, at the beginning of the year, you're learning the definitions of very basic things, and then by the end of the school year, when you're studying for finals, you don't really need to actually have that written down necessarily. So I wouldn't write that down again. Or, example problems I might not copy down. And then at the end, I would just have this paper with all of the information that was things that I needed to actually focus on remembering, and I would look through that a couple of times. But the process of writing it all down and organizing the information was really helpful. However, that is something that is sort of heavy on executive dysfunction to do. So, I find it helpful to organize everything, to, arrange the information in a way that makes more sense to me, because if I'm looking at everything just as I wrote it down in my notes, it's very overwhelming. So for me, it's not as difficult if I organize it all on a piece of paper. But I don't know if that's something that would help if the act of organizing the information is the problem for you, rather than the act of processing the information when it's all over the place. So again, this all really depends on what sorts of difficulties you have. As far as task switching and getting yourself to do things, I wish I had answers for that. I find it, for me, honestly, I find the thing that really helps is just making sure that you're taking care of yourself. Because a lot of the time, if I'm really struggling to get myself to start doing something or to stop doing something, it's because I've let myself get too tired, too worn out. It's harder after I've had a meltdown, or if I haven't been having enough sleep, or if I haven't had enough downtime. So, really just try to make sure that you're getting enough sleep and rest and food and all that fun stuff. And, you might still be dealing with some of it, but try to take care of yourself. Because it's a lot harder to avoid executive dysfunction when you're struggling with, being tired on top of it all. So that's basically how it was in college. And also in college, instructors would tend to remind us when we had something big coming up, and everybody else is also talking about what they need to do. So you do tend to get reminded of important assignments in advance, or at least I did in my college, because people were talking about that kind of thing. I'm not in college anymore. I have a job, and so the things I need to keep track of are a little different. I find it helps me. I need to keep track of, grocery list stuff, right? So let's talk about that. Grocery list and a to-do list are the two things that I want to talk about, I guess. I actually use a little app on my phone with a widget, on the home screen, where it has a to-do list, and it just shows the days of the week, and I can add to-do list items and then, remove them just from that screen. It's called ToDo List. I find that helpful because if there's something I need to do that doesn't fall into my normal routine, I can put it down there. You know, things like take out the garbage or sweep the kitchen, put away your laundry, things like that. And then I can check them off afterwards, and I feel like a lot of people get that little like sense of satisfaction from checking something off the to-do list, right? So that's nice. I also have an Amazon Echo, which I can use to add things to the to-do list if I'm not near my phone at the time. I also use it for keeping track of my grocery list. That's a separate list, but the same app setup with the to-do list on my phone and the Amazon Echo. So I just mark down anything that I don't get every single week. You know, if I get bananas every week, I'm not putting that on my to-do list, but I don't get rice every week. So if I'm out of rice, I'll make a note of that. So again, only keeping track of the things which aren't regular routine items really helps to cut down on just the bulk of everything, because you're not going to forget something you do every week, or if you do, because I have, then it is what it is. But it's not, in my opinion, worth it for me to keep track of everything that I get every week, even though I did forget waffles that one time. So in addition to those two things, you know, I do still have to keep track of things at work that I need to do. Work, we have our own systems for keeping track of all of that, and without getting into many details about my job, that does a lot of that for me. But I do still have notes on OneNote, because I still use that, about everything that I need to make a note of asking questions about, or that I need to make sure I get done, stuff like that. I still find it helpful to have some system, and I'm not saying it has to be any of the apps that I've mentioned here. Just something that you use, something that's easy for you to use, because if you're not going to use it, you're not going to use it, and there's no point. Even if it's just a Word document, or if you like writing things on paper, then it's something on paper. And that's all that I need. But I also know that visual schedules are big with a lot of people. Personally, I am better at processing things in words than pictures, so they're not helpful to me. But if you're the kind of person who is better at processing pictures than words, then you might want to look into those. And a lot of people have come up with suggestions for ways to get through that feeling when you're like stuck on trying to do a task. And I feel like things like that, for me, the biggest problem is just if I'm stuck on doing a task, then the techniques that I'll use for, you know, getting unstuck are hard to remember because I'm stuck. So you have to get into the habit of it, and that's something I'm still trying to figure out. I do find that if something interrupts me and prompts me into doing something, then that can help. So like, if I'm trying to convince myself to do something and the problem is that I'm like hard time task switching, but then I get a message I need to respond to immediately, then it forces me to switch tasks and I'm no longer as stuck. So for that reason, I find it does help sometimes to set an alarm on my phone if I need to get something done. And then, you know, even if you snooze it a couple of times, it does help you at least keep track that time is passing, which can be helpful. But the problem there, of course, is remembering to set the alarm if there's something you need to do that's not on a recurring basis, and that is also something I'm still trying to figure out. So, you know, everything is a work in progress, but I think that's the main parts for me of dealing with executive dysfunction is, number one, take care of yourself. This does require executive function, which is the catch-22 of it all, but if you have a chance to catch up on some sleep, make sure that you're getting food and liquids, take time for yourself, because if you don't, then executive dysfunction will force you to. So just get it out of the way now. So there's that. Focus on things that you're actually going to use rather than needlessly complicated systems that feel exciting to look at but aren't necessarily actually practically helpful. And try to keep things in routines, because routines are your friend as far as executive dysfunction goes. I think those are my main 3 pieces of advice, along with the other bits and pieces that I've mentioned throughout the video. So I hope this was helpful for some of you. As always, keep in mind other people might have different advice that might be more helpful for you personally, because everyone is different. And I hope you have a great day. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions for future videos, please feel free to mention them in the comments section below. Thank you and have a great day.